Do you think Val has opposite issues with the characters compared to League? It feels like all the new characters in Val are worse at their role or relevant compared to characters that have been there since the beginning of the game. In League, they're always relevant. So I want to note this question. I think this is a good question, but I want to note that this opinion is very personal to me. Meaning, like, the caveat is like, I'm a League designer. I don't work deeply on Val. So all I can really give you context on is how I believe characters should be made, which doesn't necessarily line up with necessarily how Val might believe characters should be made or like what their goals for characters are, okay? So I want to be just very clear before I give this answer. The question is, League characters tend to come out and they're always viable and they work in the game and their role, whereas it feels like Val characters sometimes come out and they're just worse than the characters that are already in the game. And like, how do you feel about that? And like, is it an issue or not? So I think there's a few things to unpack here. First of all, you shouldn't just deliberately make characters broken. I don't believe you should do that. So the first thing is like, when League releases a new character and it's really, really strong, I want you to know that like, what we're not doing is being like, this character should just be OP and then that'll make him good. Like, that's not our plan, right? So I just don't think you should make characters deliberately broken. That said, I think it is essential that when a character comes out, and again, this is personal opinion, when a character comes out, it competes with the characters in the game. Meaning that a character has to be good enough compared to the other characters in the game that they would be worth picking. That's not just from a power perspective, though. It's also from a kit perspective. So you need to compete on power, meaning like, hey, I'm actually good. But your kit also has to show things that other characters don't have, that like let you stand out. So an example of a character that I actually really, really love recently that Val released is Clove. I think Clove is a really, really cool agent. And I think one of the reasons Clove is really good is they have this death mechanic that is very unique to them. And so it means that like when you're playing Valorant and you want to select Clove, there's a reason to pick Clove instead of Omen. There's a reason to pick Clove instead of Brimstone. Even if Omen is really good, even if Brimstone is really good, there's a reason that you might want to pick Clove instead of those other two characters. And I think that's really cool. And that's something I think about a lot on League of Legends is, hey, when I'm making a character, like say, Jhin, what are the reasons that you would pick Jhin versus any other AD carry? The goal here is not to make Jhin broken. Like, what I wasn't doing when making Jhin was saying, like, how do I make Jhin completely OP so no one will pick anyone else? That's not the goal. That's not the goal. The goal is, what do I give Jhin such that regardless of state of balance, there's always something that when you like want to pick Jhin, you're like, Jhin might be weak, Jhin might be strong, but I got this. I got this. And Jinx doesn't have this. And Xayah doesn't have this. But me, if I pick Jhin, I'm going to have it, right? And so an example of this for Jhin is he has his 3000 range root, right? If you're playing Jhin, one of the things he always brings to a team, regardless of performance, is he has one of the best like follow-up engages on an AD carry. It's not Ashe, doesn't have the Ashe ult, right? But he has a 3000 range root. That's pretty nutty for Jhin, right? He's a very bursty based character. So there's things on Jhin that like will really help him sing there. And so I think what I'm getting at here is like it's really, really important that a character compete with everybody else in their own way. The other thing you have to consider then when a character is allowed to compete with the rest of the roster is what the meta is. So I'll use this as an anecdote. When I was making Vi, I got feedback for a while that she was too good because she competed with Jax. Very specifically, when I was making Vi, this was like 12 years ago, Jax was one of the meta champions and he was really, really good. And I would sometimes get feedback of like, hey, August, Vi was able to fight Jax and succeed. That's not okay. And I'd be like, well, why is that not okay? And the response to be, well, Jax is broken. We shouldn't make characters that can compete with Jax because Jax is broken. And that at face value makes a kind of sense, but then I would be like, well, are we going to change Jax? And the answer was no, like, we're not changing Jax. He's a cool character. He was a great character. And so I was like, well, if we're not changing Jax, I can't just make Vi lose to Jax all the time because we think he's broken. Vi has to understand the meta and be able to interact with it. right? And so in regards to Valorant, I think a challenge that Valorant has to think about when they're making characters is, how does your character compete against Jett and Raze, right? How does your character compete against Jett and Raze? How does your character compete against Sova? How does your character compete against Viper? And the idea here isn't how do you make a character OP compared to those characters. It's just the reality of the game is, if you're making a duelist in Valorant, for example, that duelist will be compared to Jett and will be compared to Raze. And if that duelist doesn't have something on them that stands out compared to Jett and Raze, a lot of players will just be like, well, I'm just going to keep picking Jett and Raze instead. And again, I keep having to like reinforce this because I really just want to make sure it's clear. The goal isn't to make a character who is OP compared to Jett and Raze, or a character who's OP compared to Jinx and Aphelios and Kai'Sa. The goal is to make a character who can, when a player looks at them compared to the other things in their role, it has things that allow them to stand out and succeed. So that's a general thing that I think about when I'm working on characters, is like, hey, if I'm making a character, how is this character going to be able to exist in the meta in a way that makes them feel special? And you also, though, you can't be too meta focused. I just said think about the meta, but also you can't be too meta focused because, you know, a game like League of Legends lasts for 15 years. The meta is going to change all the time, right? So your character can't be too meta focused as well. You also have to think about the biggest picture. So an example on Val that I think is rough, actually, so with considering all this, is if you look at Harbor's wall specifically, when we're talking about comparisons, I think one of the rough things that the character Harbor in Valorant runs into is that he has a wall that feels very similar to another character's wall, Viper. Viper also has a wall. But there's one big difference. Viper's wall doesn't hurt her allies, and Harbor's does. And I think there's very reasonable arguments for like which one of those interactions is correct. Like Val has a lot of value from like Val gets a lot of value from for those of you who don't play Valorant, Valorant has has basically friendly fire on a lot of their effects. Like if you throw a Molotov in Valorant and an ally stands at it, they'll take damage. In League of Legends, unfortunately, if I try to kill you on an assassin and you're my teammate, for some lame reason, my spells just don't hit you. But, you know, whatever. I digress. But in Val, like, there's friendly fire. And the vast majority of time, friendly fire is actually really good for the game because it creates a better tactical experience and it makes sure you're just not, like, throwing your spells willy-nilly. So friendly fire on abilities is generally really, really good for Val. But then the reason I'm mentioning Harbor is this character where he has a direct comparison, which is Viper. Those walls can be compared directly to each other. And Viper gets something that he just doesn't. And that could be fine. Again, that's like an isolated ability, but it's just a mentioning of like, players are going to be making that comparison in their head. They're going to be looking at Harbor and they're going to be asking themselves, well, why isn't my wall like Viper wall? And there's a lot of great reasons why it shouldn't be like Viper wall. So the advocacy here isn't make it the same as Viper wall. I'm just noting that when you have two similar mechanics, players are going to make comparisons between them. And if one character comes out on the bottom, then that could be fine. But like that's a thing where it's like players are gonna look at that and be like, well, that's why I wouldn't play this character. But you know, and then they'll go find somewhere else. They'll need to look somewhere else on the kit for why they would. This actually happened in League. I'll give an example of this in League that's actually ended up being really negative.